Okay, so we're about to make another pivot. We started off this whole project, remember, looking at starting points for theology. And we suggested that we start where the gospel starts, with trust. We saw the importance and the value of beginning that way. And then we were able to distinguish between what happens when Christianity is viewed as trust, and there's a pattern of life that one follows, and when Christianity is viewed as an intellectual operation, belief, and all that that entails with law, structure, religion, and everything else. Then we turned and we said, okay, we're going to now have to ask the great Christological questions. If we're going to have a Jesus-centered approach to things, well, who is this Jesus? And we used the fourfold model that I laid out in the Jesus-driven life. And the textual Jesus, the historical Jesus, the Jesus of the risen, the experience of the risen Christ, the Christus presens, the present Christ. And then now we're about to look at the Jesus of the tradition. But in the first three cases, that is the Jesus of the shared church experience, the Jesus of the gospel writers and Paul, the way they perceive him, and the Jesus as the scholars perceive him, the historical Jesus. In every single case, we noticed that there are plenty of debates and there's plenty of room in this, in all of this. And that there seems to be in each case, no matter whether you take a church's experience, liturgically, catechetically, or however you want to frame that, whether you take the textual Jesus, the Christologies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Hebrews, etc., whether you look at the various types of historical Jesus studies there are, the history of the discipline, the shifts and the changes that have been made. In every case, what's really key here is not getting lost in the forest for the trees. It's being able to take a big step back and recognize that each of these in their own way contribute to the knowledge of Jesus. In the same way, we're going to discover that in the Jesus of the church's tradition, there is to be found knowledge of Jesus. However, I'm going to come down fairly hard on this category. Even harder than I came down on the category of the historical Jesus, which was harder than I came down on the category of the textual Jesus, and again, which was more challenging than when I talked about the church's shared liturgical and catechetical experience, which I see as the bottom, the frame, out of which everything else is then to be correlated. In the 300 years between the death of Jesus, the King of the Jews, as asserted by Pontius Pilate, and the Nicene Creed in 325, there's a major metamorphosis of the way Jesus is understood. And there's going to be a number of factors that are going to play into this, some of which we've already discussed, some of which we'll discuss tonight as we add to them. But what we're going to look at is a bigger picture here. And we're going to ask a couple of very important questions as we move into this conversation of what's happening with Jesus in the early church as we move to Nicaea. And in particular, and for those of you that are real fans of the Nicene Creed, we're going to take a re-look at the Arian controversy tonight and the question of maybe Arius had something important to say. Just like when we revisited Marcion, and we were able to see that Marcion had some important questions. Now, he came up with the wrong answers, but so did the early church fathers. In the same way, Arius, the heretic, the arch heretic behind the Nicene Creed, also was asking some very important questions. He may have gotten the answer wrong. And it may well be that the framers of the Nicene got the answer right, but at what cost? And that's kind of the question that we're going to look at tonight. So in these 300 years between the death of Jesus and the Council of Nicaea. Remember, Constantine will become emperor in 313. A consolidation of his power begins to take place. The church is divided over the Arian controversy, and so the council is called. It's a political event, folks. The council is a political event. You know, before I move into the actual lecture here, I do need to throw in some tidbits. I don't know how many of you know this. Between the year 325 and 553, that is the 4th, 5th, and early 6th centuries, do you know the church held over 15,000 synods, conferences, councils, etc.? 15,000 over a 300 or 200-year period. Second, those councils and those synods were often attended by fistfights. Please listen to me very, very carefully here, because this is going to be very important. Even our beloved brother Athanasius, who stands behind the book on the incarnation of the Word that we all know and love, and behind, of course, the Alexandrian party at Nicaea. Athanasius was a fellow that fought, and he would fight for what he wanted. He would use force to get what he wanted. By the time we get to the 4th century, my friends, violence has become an acceptable way for bishops to deal with doctrinal disputes. Listen to me very carefully, because this is important. It suggests that this catechetical structure, this ethical substructure we've talked about of loving the enemy other, of turning the other cheek, this had now been lost. If the bishops who are shepherding the flock of God, when they get together and they're in fisticuffs and fighting, that says a lot about the condition of Christianity and a lot about the condition of the church. I will share my screen with you for a moment to show you. Nope, not that. This is from the book Voting for God by Ramsay MacMullen. And so he observes, when you multiply the number of councils by the 120 provinces, and the actual number of them was a little lower in AD 325, but higher in 553, the councils over this time span cannot have total less than 15,000 of them. And then he starts by asking, well, how many were present? And so there's this entire scholarly apparatus in a book, Voting for God, which also contains, by the way, the stories of the fisticuffs. Okay, so if you like that kind of thing, Voting for God by Ramsay MacMullen. From Jesus' death until basically the end of the 1st century, Christianity is predominantly Jewish. That is, it's Christianity in the synagogues that is going to be dominant. This is going to be the case in North Africa. It's going to be the case in Palestine. And it's going to be the case wherever there was a James, Peter, Jerusalem church missionary movement. The Pauline movement was one thing, but it was small. So much so that when we estimate the total number of Christians by the time of the destruction of the temple, we're looking at perhaps 20,000 empire-wide. But after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE and the flight of Jewish Christianity into Pella and north into Galilee, and the, as it were, loss of hegemony of the Jerusalem church. In that time period, following the first destruction of the temple, to the second destruction of the temple in 135 under Hadrian, in that time frame, our Gospels are going to be written. Judaism is going to begin rethinking and reconstituting itself at the Council of Jamnia and following. We see Gentile churches beginning to predominate, as well as leaders of these churches now having Gentile names. We see a split between the church and the synagogue occurring in the first decades of the 2nd century. We see this in Marcion, of course, but we also see it in the appropriation of the Septuagint and the question of which group, that is the Christian group or Judaism, which group had the right to interpret these texts. And there was what has been called the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. Now, it is important to note that by the end of the 2nd century, both Judaism and Christianity will come out with their canon. For the Christians, it's this concept of a New Testament canon, which is not thoroughly framed and won't be thoroughly framed for several hundred years. But for the Jews, it's Mishnah in the year 200, published by Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, and it is complete and total. It's finished. And then after that, for Judaism comes the Talmud, the 2 Talmuds, the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds, whereas Christianity would just finish up its canon and then add its creeds to it. But in the 2nd century, as the church is moving apart, as Gentile Christianity is dominating, there's also going to be another phenomenon in the ancient world that is going to be a major and significant issue for the church to deal with, and that's Christian Gnosticism. That is the belief system that the spirit world and the material world are completely and utterly cut off from one another. It is a hardcore dualism that Gnostics buy into. And it's the Gnostic commentator on the Gospel of John, Valentinus, the first commentator on the Gospel of John around the year 150. That was one major reason the Gospel of John was almost not accepted into the canon, because the Gnostics love that gospel. The writer of the Gospel of John is often confused as though it's a Gnostic gospel, or Clement of Alexandria calls it a spiritual gospel. It's really not, but it's easy to read that way. And Gnosticism factors in so much so that by the time we get to Irenaeus in the year 180 and he writes his book against the heretics, he's got entire genealogies of these Gnostics. So in this time frame, in this early time frame, Christianity is separating from Judaism, and it's drinking from the philosophy of Hellenism. That is the Hellenistic worldview, which includes a view of his human history. It includes a view of God, a view of the human being, a view of social life. It has all of that already built in. And the church, which had come out of this Jewish matrix, has now evolved and is transmuting in this Hellenistic matrix. And I use that word carefully because it does transmute. It changes into something different. Partly, again, because when the right questions got asked, the wrong answers were given by everybody. And so one of our tasks in these talks is to go back and revisit these questions, recognize where the wrong answers were given, give the right answer, or give a better answer at least, so that we can move on. The 2 Christian church problem, Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity, was never solved. It's not solved to this day. And Jewish Christianity would go its own way. In its later literature, of course, Paul would become the Antichrist. It's a very, very changed form of Jewish Christianity that Muhammad will meet. Muhammad doesn't know the Christianity of Rome or the great centers in the East. He learns Christianity from a Jewish Christian sect. If these were the negative factors in the 2nd century and in the 3rd century, there are some positive factors. There's liturgical development, which we can trace. And we're going to talk about one of those tonight in the use of the early Roman baptismal creed as the formulary or the structure by which creeds become built. There is an enormous emphasis in the 2nd century on the catechetical tradition. And that emphasis on the catechetical tradition, it has its peak around the year 250, which was the time of the Donatist crisis in North Africa, where in North Africa at this time, where there was persecution and priests either renounced the faith or they gave up the scrolls, they gave up the apostolic scrolls. After the persecution was over, the question was raised, are these priests fit to be priests? And the answer given by Donatus and his people were, no, they're not. The priesthood is not indelible. These guys screwed up, they're out. And so you have this major controversy going on in North Africa at this time, but it's also the time that the catechetical school is at its strongest. The earliest catechetical school we know of is started by Origen, predecessor, Pentanus in Alexandria around the year 180. Origen is a catechumenate in this school and will go on to become the teacher of this school until he moves to Caesarea Antioch. So with this liturgical development, this catechetical emphasis, there's a third positive element, and that's the creation of the apostolic tradition, or what you and I would call the bishopric, that is the overseer of a group of churches, and the biblical canon. So all of this is happening, and at the same time, at the very same time, the big question about Jesus looms. Who was he? Well, for someone like Justin Martyr, Jesus fulfills two significant roles. The first is that of the promised Messiah. Justin wants to use the Jewish scriptures to demonstrate, much like Matthew, that is his favorite text, that Jesus is this Messiah that had been promised of old in the Old Testament law and prophets. But at the same time, Justin, even though he never cites the Gospel of John, and so there's debate about whether Justin Martyr knows the Gospel of John or not, I don't think he does. But at any rate, he's the one that's going to bring in the Greek theory of the logos, okay? He will bring in that concept into Christianity, or the writer of the Gospel of John had already done it. But Justin Martyr's logos is identical to that of the Hellenistic logos, whereas the logos of the Gospel of John is distinct. That's a major, major difference between the Gospel of John and the writer's use of logos and Justin Martyr. The church has followed Justin Martyr and assimilated this Hellenistic logos, which is violence, the Heraclitan polemos, violence, war. That's the logos. That's what structures reality in Heraclitan philosophy. Justin assimilates the two. And that's one big way that the Janus-faced God starts to get created in Christianity. But with Justin Martyr's question about Jesus relating to this logos, now what you've done is you've taken definitional views from the ancient world of who the gods are, the structure of the gods, or who the God is, and the structure of the heavenly hierarchy of angels and demons and other demigods, perhaps. You've taken all of that and you've slotted Jesus into this. This is the problem that presents itself in the 2nd century when the apologists want to slot Jesus into their theological worldview. Here's where Jesus belongs in this worldview. It might be overall, but he belongs here, rather than saying the whole worldview is wrong and Jesus doesn't belong in this. He's crushed it. He's ended it. They didn't see that. They couldn't say that in the 2nd century. They would have been executed as atheists, which they were often called anyway. We see this problem of Christian philosophy and its relationship to the Bible really pronounced about 40 years after Justin Martyr, when Tertullian, the North African lawyer, remember, from what is now modern day Libya, the North African lawyer, who gave us the doctrine of penance and other things. We've talked about Tertullian before, but he asked a very important question. He said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? That is, what does the philosophy department have to do with the religion department? That's the question that Tertullian raised. Now, that question's been answered in multiple ways, but Tertullian was at least aware that there was a significant problem when one was reading this Jewish story, this Jewish tradition about Jesus through the lens of Greek philosophical worldviews. It's not for nothing that North Africa is the more or most significant area of the early church in the 3rd century, with the development of monasticism, as well as the development of the catechetical schools over in Alexandria. Now, a sub-point I want to make before I move on into a discussion of Nicaea. We've talked about various factors to keep in mind as the church is engaging and disengaging from Judaism in various ways this is perceived and dealt with in these 200 years. I tried to figure out a way to get this logically in the lecture and couldn't do it, so I'm just simply going to say this. There's a lovely little booklet by Hans von Campenhausen called The Virgin Birth in the Early Church. The value of that book lies in this. He's able to show from the early church fathers that whenever the virgin birth is brought up, is not to demonstrate Jesus' divinity, but his humanity. So that's going to become important in conversations, because in later years, later centuries, the virgin birth is used to prove Jesus' divinity. Whereas for the early church, the fact that he's born of Mary proves his humanity. So I'm just going to slot that in there, and it has no place to go with what was before it or what's after it, but it's going to be an important piece to factor in. And again, the evidence I derive from Hans von Campenhausen's The Virgin Birth in the Early Church. In the 1960s and 70s, everything came under revision. And in the 1970s, one of the things that came under serious revision in church historical circles was the question of Arius and Arianism, and what was really going on at Nicaea. This is now in the post-ecumenical era, that is, as Christianity's transitioning from intra-religious dialogue between Catholics and Reformed and Lutherans and Orthodox and this and that and the other. They're transitioning from that to Christians in dialogue with Jews, Islam, Buddhists, etc. In this time frame, in the 70s and 80s, the question of Arianism got revisited, and a book published by Robert Gregg and Dennis Groh. Now, I don't know how much you know about the controversy at Nicaea, and I'm going to give you a very simplistic approach to this, but it kind of goes like this. It is a question of whether Jesus was created or not. That is, does Jesus exist eternally as the Logos, or is the Logos a creation? Now, Arius suggested that the Logos was the creation. And it's Athanasius and the Nicene framers of the Creed who are going to turn around and go, no, 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 no. The Son is of the essence of the Father, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, blah, blah, blah. But Arius had the biblical text on his side. He had Proverbs 8, which speaks about wisdom being the first of God's creation. And wisdom and logos are technical coterminous terms, and the writer of the fourth gospel was certainly aware of this. And because the fourth gospel doesn't seem to suggest one way or another whether the logos was created or not, Arius was using Proverbs to help substantiate his case. But for Arius, the bottom line was this: if the logos is eternal, that means Jesus' humanity is going to end up being different than ours. And that means his way of life, this pattern, this ethical pattern, is not something that we can follow. If he's different than us, we can't follow it. But if he's the same as us, then we can follow that path to find the Father, just as he did. So when the early church, when the framers of the Nicene Creed come to this question, instead of asking this, whether the question could be asked differently and thus framed differently and given a positive, a more beneficial answer, instead they opted for the complete opposite. The Logos, the Son, is eternal. And from that point on, the doctrine of the Trinity becomes abstracted from God as God is revealed in the gospel tradition. God is revealed through the Son by the Spirit. The doctrine of the Trinity becomes something abstract that we put our faith in. And of course, it's also at this time, Christians are flooding the empire, the catechism's going out, and so the only requirement to become a Christian is to confess the right creed. And that's why there are going to be battles after battles after battles for hundreds of years, especially when bishops are deposed because they won't say this church's creed, and so this church gets its people to foment unrest over here. They kick that bishop out, and then they install their own bishop, and this goes on and on and on. Happened to Athanasius 5 times in Alexandria. He gets exiled, and a Neo-Arian bishop gets installed. This is the major issue that haunts the empire after Constantine's death, because Constantinus, Constantine's son, is an Arian. He's following Arius. And if you want an account of that battle between Athanasius and Constantius, there's the great book by Timothy Barnes, Theology and Politics in the Constantinian Empire. And for the 60 years between 320 and 380, I mean, it's an incredible read. I mean, we're dealing here with some serious violence, all over language. I want to read to you from Gregg and Gross, Early Arianism. Arians liken the creative activity of the Son to the work of Moses, the one under divine orders. Bringing into being or creating has less to do with genetic laws or ontological categories than with the willed action of the sovereign God. And existence by implication is defined not by the stable state dictated by one's nature, but by events, each having its own when, or hota, which signal the creator's election into a relationship of promise. And my friends, that may have not been very clear, but what the author's saying here is what Paul has to say in regard to how we become children of God. We become adopted. We are adopted into the family of the Father. That is all Arius was really trying to assert. And he does this by saying Jesus too was adopted into the Godhead. So Jesus is created first. Arius wanted to protect the possibility of the Christian life, this model, What was it then that Athanasius and the Nicene party were seeking to keep safe? They were seeking to keep safe that there is no God behind God, which is an much earlier heresy known as Sabellianism, after a guy named Sabellius, who said there's God, and then there's God revealed as Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. But there's this God here reveals himself as Father, then as Son, then as Spirit. But the problem is you have a God behind this God, this doctrine of the Trinity. That's called modalism. First God is Father, then God is Son, then God is Spirit. Well, the dispensationalists do this. You have God the Father in the Old Testament, Jesus the Son in his ministry, and now the Holy Spirit in the church. That's just another form of Sabellianism or modalism. Paul Tillich would be another modern example. Most liberals are modalists in one way or another. What Athanasius and the Nicene party are trying to protect, however, is that the fullness of the Father is revealed in the fullness of the Son. That's what they're trying to protect. They're trying to make sure that what we call the economic Trinity, that is the Trinity as we understand their interrelations, God the Father revealed through the Son by the Spirit, those economic relations go back into the ontological Trinity, the very being of God. That is, the God behind the doctrine of the Trinity is not different than the God revealed in the doctrine of the Trinity. That's what Athanasius was trying to protect. Both Arius and Athanasius were trying to protect something important, and unfortunately they got in the way of each other. And when we needed both, we've ended up with neither, because the church has no longer practiced the catechetical tradition. And for most people, the creeds are absolute nonsense or confusion. So we've lost the whole thing. It's my argument that if we retain Arius's question asking about how we follow Jesus, how this pattern of salvation works itself out for us, and at the same time recognize that that pattern of salvation lies within the very character of God as God, then we can actually have our cake and eat it too. That is, we can in fact wrestle with the human Jesus without denying his divinity. And we can wrestle with the divine Jesus without denying his humanity. Because the one thing we don't do is we don't make the mistake of putting them together incorrectly. And that's next week's talk when it comes to Jesus and Charleston. We are learning to put these two together properly. And so next week we'll talk about how we connect the human Jesus and the divine Jesus, that is the perspectives together, and how we can frame that, hold them together. One way to do that is to recognize with Thomas Torrance, and some of you are familiar with Tom Torrance or T.F. Torrance. His brother was James Torrance. Their kids, Ian and oh shoot, I can't remember. They're at Prince Allen at Princeton. I mean, the Torrance family is a rich family of Scottish theologians. Tom Torrance wrote a very important essay in his book, Transformation and Convergence in the Frame of Knowledge. I want to ask you a question, man. If you're an editor, would you put that as a book title? Does that sound like an exciting book, like you just have to read it today? Transformation and Convergence in the Frame of Knowledge, all right? Anyway, but there's an important essay in here on Athanasius, Einstein, and Barth. And one of the reasons that that I take the position I do is that I follow Torrance's argument, where he says that when Athanasius comes to the question of God revealing God's self, he takes the same identical approach to that question that Einstein took with regard to physics and that Barth would take with regard to theology. And he lays out the case for this epistemic approach to that which is real and that which can be known. And so I will say this for the Nicene Creed. When it comes to the Nicene Creed, it is best, I think, understood not as a set of propositions into which one places faith. It is best understood as a hermeneutic. That is, the doctrine of the Trinity is not something that we believe as much as it is the lens through which we believe. The doctrine of the Trinity in Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics is the prolegomena. It is not the substance. In Schleiermacher, the doctrine of the Trinity comes at the end. In my book, The Jesus-Driven Life, I followed Schleiermacher, and I ended up with the doctrine of the Trinity. If I was to write that book now, I would write that differently. I think with Barth, we need to recognize the doctrine of the Trinity is not something abstract, but it's a hermeneutic. It's a way of saying the one that we name as Father is completely and utterly known in the one we call the Son. And the Son is completely and utterly revealed in our hearts and minds by the Spirit. There is no God behind God. When we know the Spirit, we don't know the Spirit directly, we know the Son. But we don't know the Son directly, and through the Son, we know the Father indirectly. The Son mediates the Father to us, and the Spirit mediates the Son to us. And so the doctrine of the Trinity gives us confidence that what we can say about Jesus is exactly that which we can say about the Father and the Spirit, and that there is to be no distinguishing in that sense. That's what the doctrine of the Trinity does. Now, are there questions that are going to remain? Yes. When Jesus suffered, did the Father suffer? There's a question from the early church, you know. And it's been answered both yes and no. The most important thing about recognizing that the doctrine of the Trinity is a hermeneutic is that it allows us then to not conceive of this category titled God in the abstract, nor does it allow us to conceive of this category called the human being in the abstract. We are always dealing with a very, very concrete relationship in the Jesus tradition. That is, as we have it framed in the Gospels and in Paul, that the Father has a relationship to the Son, and the Son has a relationship to the Father, and that the Son mediates the Father to us and mediates us to the Father. Everything is done through that very specific human being, Jesus of Nazareth, who, as we saw, was exalted and given all authority over everything. The second thing is, if we're going to shift away from viewing the doctrine of the Trinity as a set of propositions and to more as a hermeneutic, we're also shifting away from metaphysics to phenomenology. We're far more interested in the human Jesus of Nazareth as he can be understood from the textual Jesus, from the historical Jesus side of things. We're very interested in that because we have lots of questions about our own anthropology. Who are we? What does it mean to be a human being? If we shift from the metaphysical, that is this abstract philosophical discussion of the Son's being and the persons of the Trinity and how they're one and really three and all of that kind of stuff that we do to try and explain it, we're just rehashing Pythagoras's what's the relation of the one to the many, but now we're just doing it in Christian terms. If we can get away from that and get to that which is observable, that is the Son's relationship to the Father in the gospel tradition, then we have something we can work with, both in terms of how we understand God, because the entry of Jesus into the picture is the entry of God's no to all our gods on the cross, and God's yes to Jesus in the resurrection as a chip off the old block. You are my beloved Son, I will give you my name. All the gods die in Jesus' death. The living God raises Jesus, who now becomes the lens through which we see and understand who the Father of all creation is. Now, in these closing remarks, I want to suggest to you that there's a way to come at the Nicene Creed that doesn't, I think, overly or excessively load it with baggage. I have put up in the group an ebook that contains my reflections on the Nicene Creed, written now 8 years ago, I believe. And I pretty much would still hold to most of that. I'm fairly certain, having not read it in a few years. But one of the things I did was I asked, what happens if instead of reading the Creed through the language of Platonic metaphysics and philosophy and words like ousia and prosopon and energeia and hypostasis, what if we instead read this in terms of drama? Now, you'll recall back in late June, early July, I pointed out the importance of doing theology as drama. What if we asked about the character of the Son? Because the Son reveals something. He reveals the character of the Father. Now, in metaphysics, you could say he reveals the nature of the Father. But character is a much better word, because your character is the way you relate to others, and we are not talking about an abstract God, but a God that's very relational. And so we want to know that this God, this Father that we're relating to, that there are expectations we can have when we approach this Father, because they're the same we would have when we approach the Son, because the Son reveals the Father. It's this question of character, or now reading the Nicene Creed through the lens of mimetic theory. Here's the problem with the Creed. Willard Swartley pointed this out as a great omission in his book, Covenant of Peace, at the very last, at the end of the book. He says, you go immediately from the virgin birth to his trial and crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate. You go from beginning to end, as though everything in the middle, as though the life story of Jesus, as though his teachings, as though his character was not significant. We are now just at these great theological moments, virgin birth, crucifixion, resurrection, as though that could capture the character of Jesus. That's a great omission by the Creed. I used to think that that was okay because the church still was passing on the catechetical tradition, until I realized that by this time the catechetical tradition was already ground into the dust. And it's little wonder that from the late 3rd century into the 4th and 5th centuries, Christianity, following Nicaea, becomes more and more Gnostic. It is the pro-Nicean Apollinaris who comes up with the idea that the Logos, Jesus was fully human except for his mind. He had the divine mind, the divine Logos. He could think God's thoughts. Now, I don't know about you, but I've often heard in the church that Jesus could heal because he was divine. Jesus could think God's thoughts, and we don't think God's thoughts, and this and that and the other. That, my friends, is the ultimate form of Gnosticism, because Jesus, just like Arius feared, becomes completely differentiated from us. It's also that particular line of thinking that's going to produce that wonderful line from Cyril, that which is not assumed, that which is not taken up, cannot be healed. And so if Jesus has the divine mind and he doesn't have a human mind, then the human mind can't be healed, at least in that form of Gnostic Christianity. And so here we are sitting at 2,000 years later, and Philip Lee's book, Against the Protestant Gnostics, still stands, demonstrating that the entire Protestant tradition, conservative and liberal, at least as it is in America, is nothing more than Gnostic. And so no matter how much time has passed, no matter how much water is under the bridge since the 2nd century, the fact is, we are still dealing with the same phenomenon that some writers of the New Testament had to deal with, that the early church had to deal with, and that Christianity for 2,000 years has had to deal with. And that is the major problem of Gnosticism. And the reality that we have to acknowledge that it's a pro-Nicene Christianity that tends toward Gnosticism. And so it will become important to revisit the question of the humanity of Jesus, what it is, what it means, how we understand it. And that's what we'll be doing here as we close our series in December. But for tonight, that will be all.